Well, for more, let's go to Berlin. Grégoire Roos is director of the Europe, Russia and Eurasia programs at the think tank Chatham House. Thank you for speaking with us here on France 24.
Thank you very much for your invitation.
So a lot of under pressure diplomacy, under pressure because of that bleak situation on the ground inside of Ukraine at the outset of winter. Before I ask you about events here in Paris, your reaction to what's happening militarily, particularly those strikes in the Black Sea.
Well, we have seen by now that even as the negotiations between the Americans and the Russians have been intensifying, Russia has kept intensifying its attacks on Ukrainian strategic targets and civilians altogether. So to keep the tensions as strong and high as they possibly can, the Ukrainians are doing their best to retaliate, focusing on strategic targets. What is interesting is to see the reaction of President Erdogan, who said that that was a kind of escalation, worrying escalation, I quote him, and that should stop. So the objective of the Ukrainians is reached, if I may say so, insofar as they've managed to intensify heightened pressure on Russia and indirectly on the Americans.
Yeah, and we have Emmanuel Macron among the statements he's made. We're going to go through several of them. One where he's promised, there's another European Council meeting due to take place this month before the end of the year, promised that sanctions on Russia's energy sector would be, quote, the highest since the beginning of the full-scale invasion back in 2022. Are those empty words, or can Europe tighten the screws on the oil and gas sector of Russia?
Well, the answer is yes. Technically, Europe can heighten pressure on oil and gas, and actually even on uranium if it wanted to. The question is, can it afford to pay the political price? And indirectly, can the US accept 1 year before the midterm elections next year to see the price of the oil barrel go up? The question is, can we really take 5 million oil barrels off market? Technically, we could, but this will have obvious implications for the oil prices.
Now, that's also going to have implications for voters here in France, voters in Germany, where you are. There was the Donald Tusk, the Prime Minister of Poland, visiting today, Friedrich Merz. They too spoke with Emmanuel Macron and Volodymyr Zelensky. How much political capital are they willing to spend?
I think they're willing to spend as much political capital as they possibly can, provided it doesn't hurt them any further in the polls, which these days is quite a challenge. In truth, although there has been a lot of words, comforting, supportive towards the Ukrainian president, there isn't much that Europeans can do, except perhaps to heighten the financial superpower that they could put on the table. I mean, technically, without going into too many details, from the MFF to the European Investment Bank, Europe could align up to 1 trillion euros if it really wanted to. The only problem is the political leadership in Berlin, in Paris, and in many other countries across the bloc is not strong enough to provide those leaders with the necessary leeway, if you will, to impose such a change at the European level. But it is clear that given the mindset in Washington at the moment, if the Europeans do not show the money, they will not regain any relevance nor seat at the negotiating table.
So this original 21-point plan that was leaked, according to the Bloomberg news agency, reads in part like a wish list from Moscow. Does that change minds here in Europe? Does that mean that the European Council summit will be a different one?
Well, I think it gives Europe a sense of urgency. I mean, in almost 4 years of conflict between Ukraine and Russia, this is actually the first draft peace deal that we have seen. As morally dubious as it is, as diplomatically mediocre as it is, it so happens that it is the only draft on the table, and that Europeans have been unable, for various different reasons, to come together and put a draft on the table. So there's the feeling that the Americans are making progress, whatever whatever Europe thinks, and that the Russians have found their negotiating pals in Washington. So there's a sense of urgency. And that is why Europe is not in its best negotiating situation at the moment.
Is Europe back in the game since they were blindsided a little over a week ago by this plan unveiled by Washington and Moscow?
It's very difficult to answer positively, for the simple reason that what we see is that if the Ukrainians were to trust either the Americans or the Europeans, it's very difficult that they would actually go for the Europeans. For a simple reason is that Europe doesn't have the political nor the defense capabilities, the means to provide Ukraine with solid security guarantees. So we live at a time when if there were one choice to be made by the Ukrainians, they would definitely align with the Americans, even if, of course, we've seen very strong words of friendship between the Ukrainian and the French president earlier this afternoon. At the same time, you had Rustem Umerov, the National Security Secretary of Ukraine, and Secretary Rubio, who actually worked hard to get to a first kind of, if not an agreement, at least they are closer to what they were last week. So one thing is the PR, if you will. The other aspect is the real diplomatic side of the negotiation. And on that side, it's still the Americans in the driving seat.
You mentioned Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State. Who's running the show when it comes to this negotiation? Is it the State Department? Is it Donald Trump's friend Steve Witkoff? We also see that Jared Kushner, his son-in-law, is back in the frame. As Witkoff heads to Moscow, who's got the ear of the U.S. president?
Well, to answer your question, I'd say I think your journalist at the Elysee Palace just mentioned a moment ago that after President Zelensky and President Macron chatted after the arrival of President Zelensky, they actually called Steve Witkoff after they called Mark Rutte and some other European leaders. So it shows that in terms of game, if I may say so, the stronger game is in the hands of Steve Witkoff. But I think the strategic strength of the US here is that they've managed to somehow blur the lines. You know, Rubio remains in the negotiation channels. As I said, he's just met with Umerov earlier this afternoon. But Witkoff and Jared Kushner are sitting with the Russians. So you have somehow two teams, one dealing with the Ukrainians, the other dealing with the Russians, and the Europeans are in between.
Grégoire Roos, so many thanks for being with us from Berlin.
Thank you very much indeed.